Well, welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. Well, recently we had a great chat about the 3-30-300 rule and how we need to see 3 trees from our window and have 30% canopy cover. And also in England and Wales, with biodiversity net gain, there's this thing called tree trading rules. So if we're taking out trees on site, we've got to plant a whole bunch more on site or elsewhere. And I'm going to talk today with an expert and a practitioner on planting trees on buildings. Now, we know this isn't a new idea, but it's not routinely carried out. And I want to find out a bit more about it. So, welcome to Alistair Bayford of Frost Landscapes and Construction. Thanks, Alistair.
Pleasure to be with you, Sharon.
Alistair, how long have you been planting trees on buildings?
All my career. So I ventured out into this world of landscape 2001, and since then there hasn't been a project on a roof that hasn't had some form of a tree planted on it. And I suppose I define roofs as anything that might be up in the sky, or a similar environment would be a podium landscape over a basement car park or over, lower floors of a building.
And where have you worked in the world?
I would say primarily London, but work up in Manchester and Liverpool. So I suppose you could say following the towers as they've kind of emerged, and as London and its ambitions to grow higher into the sky and maximize the amount of real estate and floor space by building vertically, and our desire as human beings to be surrounded by green. Buildings are having gardens, as high as 50 floors up in the sky. So it creates its challenges.
Wow. And are you finding that this trend is increasing, that more people are planting trees on roofs in the
Yeah, definitely.
last, say,
I think with I suppose ambitions for reducing carbon in construction and this trend now for retrofit and cut and carve, but not least this kind of drive to get people back into work. We've seen an
yeah,
acceleration of clients and I suppose building managers wanting to provide the best environments for people to work, and I suppose landscape is one of those key factors. I think during COVID, um, bizarrely, the thing that we take for granted, we all became acutely aware of how important it is. So I suppose the projects that we're working on now are certainly delivering high quality landscape terraces, so that employers can provide the best facilities for their staff coming back to work, and that creates breakout space. It creates somewhere very nice to have your lunch, and it brings a whole series of other benefits as a result. So I don't think necessarily roof gardens are driven solely by biodiversity. I think there is now a very big wellness agenda when roof terraces and spaces are being designed. And of course, we know that shade and larger plants create an environment in which we can feel sheltered and have a much more intimate experience with landscape. So yeah, it's going to be the trend going forwards, and I think as we are our buildings get taller, and I think our ambition for landscape gets bigger. So we just end up being challenged more, which is great.
yeah, I love that. I hadn't occurred to me that it'll be mainly commercial and business use that would result in these roof terrace gardens. But what about residential blocks? Are you seeing
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
planting on
definitely.
those?
I think there is when you're looking at even mixed use buildings or if they're residential, I suppose there's this landlords would want people to stay for as long as possible. I think, and that's about building a community. Um, and what we often find is that you'll have a building cut in half. So if it was a 20-story building, you might have all of your communal facilities halfway up the building. So in I suppose in more terms, we see roof terraces for communal use on level 10. That means people above the terrace can access it and people below the terrace can access it. And those things can provide, again, areas to exercise, areas to walk a dog, areas to sunbathe, areas to bring up children. So I think there is a pattern, whether it's commercial or residential, that roof gardens or roof space is being utilised for creating external areas where communities can come together and, you build that sense of community rather than it just being a 60s tower block where you rarely saw people other than in the lift or the stairwell. So yeah, it's changing greatly.
That's great. That really is brilliant. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty. So I've worked on schemes in London and I've said, let's get some trees on the buildings. And then what I hear is, well, it's going to cost so much money because
Yeah.
of the structure. I know you're not a structural engineer, but just from the work that you do, have you been involved with discussions on loading, or have you been told how much weight you can put on there?
Yes, yeah, definitely. It's one of the factors that we are constantly working either within defined parameters or we're flagging questions about specification and sizing of trees on planting. Of course, it really depends what growing medium they've been produced in. And I say that whether it's a field grown or a containerized tree, it's very much the actual mass in the tree and the root ball is dependent on what soil is surrounding those roots. We've then got factors around the soil build-ups and how that roof planter, for want of a better description, is being created. So whether there's a very shallow soil build-up that's above void former. So in real terms, the loading constraints can often then impact the environment in which we're putting these trees. So,
Yeah.
I'm a horticulturalist. You don't get the green bit without the brown bit, and the brown bit is the bit that we'll forget. Soil is fundamental to supporting trees and green infrastructure. So, if that soil is designed in a way that, and with all roofs, we don't like wet soil on roofs because it's heavier. So the intention is you get water away very quickly, which means you haven't got water retention in those soils sufficient for high water demand plants and trees that have huge volume of water storage in their leaves and their stems. So I think it creates as many constraints and challenges in maintenance and establishment than it does actually physically getting the trees up onto the podium. And of course, it's not going to tangibly affect the performance of the roof, but trees grow, so their mass increases over time as well, and there's always sufficient tolerances in the design of a slab to accommodate that. But we can often be influenced by the position on a slab as well. So if it's under a structural beam, you might have greater tolerances. If it's not, then of course you're trying to work miracles with trees to provide size on planting, but equally manage weight loadings as well.
And so the soil, so you have the slab, and then presumably you have like a drainage layer, do you? Talk me
Yeah,
through the
so
sandwich.
I suppose typical construction would be slab, waterproofing protection layer, drainage layer, which may well be just a simple drainage board, or now more commonly we have blue roofs, which providing kind of a suds attenuation facility, and then above that you'd have either layers of void former where you have challenges with loadings, so that will build up the depth, and then cut into that you might have a tree pit, which has got somewhat greater soil depths, but we can be working anywhere between 600 mil depth and 300 to 150 millimeters depth of soil above that construction. And the shallower the soil, you'll kind of, it indicates that the more challenges we've got with weight loadings.
So with the trees, you're planting in 600 millimeters of soil. which we know that
Yeah,
trees, is that
yeah.
all?
Well, I think the greatest depth we're delivering at the moment is a meter, but that may well only be for a meter radius from the tree stem. And then the rest of the plant is built out with void former on which we have soil depths that can support small shrubs, um, slightly larger shrubs than herbaceous perennials. So it's a very artificial environment. It's an incredibly challenging environment. So, if you think about water uptake, particularly for some species, and not least, these are very permeable, light soils. So they don't have that kind of structure that a traditional soil, a clay soil or a sandy loam on the ground, whereby the root structure can really embed itself in, and then you're dealing with at what point does that tree become quite loose in when it's wind loaded? So in high winds, you're then thinking about how that tree's tied down both during establishment, but then equally in the long term when it's actually got much more of an axis and pivot. You could see a tree go over on a roof because technically it's not tied down to the soil. So there's all sorts of things we need to think about in
Wow.
terms of getting the tree pinned to the roof, in for want of a better
Yeah. I
description.
just want to go back to an earlier point about the soil. Final point on the soil. Do you use like biochar or organic fertilizers to enrich this sort of fairly, what you're describing as a light, loose, friable soil?
Yeah, so I would kind of say there's a balance between permeability, um, in order to minimize the saturated weight of the soil. So you're kind of not seeing a soil on a roof get to what we'd call field capacity. That just isn't allowed because you're technically dealing with a denser soil mass, and the aspirations and the performance of that soil is to get um, water away very, very quickly. So what we're tending to find is it's made up of quite large aggregate substrates, be it brick, be it leaker, be it pumice. So those materials have quite low water holding capabilities. So we are, I'm going to say, producing something at the start which is sufficient for the needs of the plants. However, as you know, this is a system which is reliant on inputs. So in effect, a tree will grow, it will produce leaves. Those leaves will then, in autumn, if it's deciduous, fall to the floor, and the carbon cycle will replenish the nutrients and the needs of those kind of plants and trees naturally. That's how the carbon cycle works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in our commercial clean world, where we take all of that input out, so leaves that fall to the ground, often these trees aren't necessarily in large areas of open soil. So we're not putting the natural inputs back in. So we are having to artificially, I think I described to you in a earlier conversation we've had, is that, you can't forget that vegetation up on a roof is almost kept in critical care. That's how
Yeah.
we have to input lots, and that can be, some of our schemes we've got dosterone going into the irrigation. All of these schemes are irrigated. They don't exist up on a roof without permanent irrigation. And we're seeing a trend now where that irrigation is still live in what we call the traditional period of, you know, winter. So it's we wouldn't expect nowadays to, whenever we do, sorry, we do expect it nowadays that irrigation systems are a permanent feature in those artificial landscapes. And what that then means is that the more irrigation you put on a scheme, the more leaching you have, the more nutrients you lose. So therefore, the more nutrients you need to put back. And just like a sandy soil, they're lean anyway. They're not holding on to nutrients as a richer, denser soil would do. So, we have to monitor our soils. We have to test them regularly. We then have to work out what we need to put in them to ensure that those plant communities are supported and can establish and can perform and look good, if that's the right word, for the clients that are using those spaces.
That's a lot of work because the environment is colder, hotter, wetter, drier, windier than anything
Yeah.
we have on the
Yeah.
grounds. You spoke about keeping the tree upright. What sort of methods of guying do you use?
The best form is to have a connection to the structural slab. So that's a tying eye, and then we use a kind of a underground guide system, without naming a few suppliers,
Yeah.
but it's a ratchet that keeps the root ball down. Now that is the best mechanism for us. We often, because of the limitations in perhaps getting to that solution too late, as in it hasn't been accommodated into the slab, we're then using that conventional dead man guying system, because anything else you're not actually getting a clear fix. So most effective solution we've used recently is using a sheet of reinforcement mesh. The root ball sat onto the mesh, and then the ties are kind of going over the root ball. So that's been the most effective in the absence of ties onto the structural slab itself.
And you described so well this idea of keeping a tree in critical care for our care and nature's care.
Yeah.
What's the sort of lifespan? So you've been doing this for 23 years. What's the lifespan of the average tree in your experience or your learning on a roof garden?
If I, I would say it's for as long as the user or the owner is willing to put up with that decoration. It's a bit like a house. So where buildings are constantly changing hands I suppose in the commercial market, that might be through the lease holder change, so new tenants coming in, or systematic change. So there's a number of schemes in London that have gone through extensive change that, I worked on at the start of my career. So you could say in that sense, they may have only been there for 15 years. But equally, I've replaced trees that have just timed out. They've just lost any desire to exist anymore because of
Yeah.
those factors I've described. I think early on in my career, the system wasn't designed to support trees long term. So, we are providing our trees with more now, albeit it's very artificial. So they do have sufficiently designed irrigation systems. They do have, we approach it that we're scientists as much as we are horticulturalists. So we are looking at the environment in which these trees are being planted and established. But can't also get away from the fact that they tend to have seasonal cycles more frequently. Some trees on roofs go through 2 cycles of defoliation because, wind the clock back 4 years ago, 3 years ago, when we had that incredibly dry summer, we had trees going into autumn in June, July, and then they're re-emerging in September, and they're placing huge amounts of energy into that process that they're then just exhausted the year after. So
Oh, yeah.
you have to kind of then respond to, what is the tree's needs after that shock that they've experienced the prior year. Because of course, I think people forget it. They forget that trees consume huge amounts of energy coming into leaf and
Mm.
flowering and fruiting, and then to lose those leaves and lose that opportunity to fix and store um, starches to go into winter, you effectively then got a tree that's going to go into next year, and you could say it's a bit like a marathon runner. It's, if you don't fuel it, you're not going to run another marathon immediately after you finish the next. So, these things need, importantly, attention and significant amounts of inputs to care for them.
And what sort of species do you find the most successful in the UK?
That's changed. I think I would say that's changed significantly in the last 5 years of my career. I think there's I've spoken to numerous tree suppliers and been asked this question, but there is still a predominance for quick-growing riparian-like species in London. My personal view is we should not be planting birch at all
I
in
agree.
containers or on roofs, but it's still
Yeah.
one of the most specified trees on schemes in London today. And when
Oh,
you look at, sorry, Sharon.
it just really frustrates me.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
can think of a scheme I know in Barking, which has been working on Barking regeneration, and the landscape architect designed a whole grove of birch trees. They weren't on the roof; they were in the ground, and they're not doing very well. And I see it over and over again because birch are so sensitive, aren't they?
Usually, I think they're what I saw during that summer was blistering of the
Yes.
birch. Now, we can't forget that in those environments we're not only exposing to high transpiration rates through the wind, and we're not necessarily designing or responding with irrigation systems that would replace that water being lost from those trees. But the increased amount of glass, the refraction from the glass, and the fact that the sugary sap that is so close to the surface of the birch stem means that it can boil. And I've seen birch just being boiled to death and
Yeah.
blistering coming up the day after, and they never recover from that. Um, and I just feel that there are so many trees that provide significant opportunities in the UK, and particularly on roofs. We're not, we should never really be planting clear stem trees. It should always be multi stems.
Mm.
And I've kind of had great success with trees like Australia, Nissa, Parotia in the last 5 years, where they've really responded well to those stressful environments. Gymnocladus, the Kentucky bean tree, that's been fantastic in
Lovely.
London, but it's just not specified enough. And importantly, if you consider a grower who's responding to demand, and importantly, the specifier is the cause. If landscape architects continue to specify trees, growers will continue to grow them. And the
Exactly.
and the problem with production is you're on an 8-year cycle. These things don't
Yeah.
just appear. They need investment, time, and growth. So the
Yes.
trend needs, or the change needs to happen now. Um, Otherwise, they'll continue to produce birch en masse. You've only got to walk around a tree nursery to see what the most common tree on that nursery is, and it tends to fall into the category of birch, amelanchias, prunus. All short-lived, quick pioneer species that, by virtue, are quite high water demand and aren't going to survive in our changing climate.
And what about the general maintenance? We talked about irrigation and nutrition. What about, I mean, are you as a company routinely engaged to keep the trees looking tidy, clearing up leaves and looking at diseases, that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah, yeah. I think it's part of our service, and I would go as far to say that if a client understands the importance of it, we're engaged properly. And by properly, we equipped our teams on the ground with that key decision as a horticulturalist. Be influenced by that big yellow dot in the sky. Don't be prescriptive. Don't tell us when. I think you have to be very agile and respond to the needs of the tree. So, we've on a roof in Finsbury, we have 5 cornice, and they're all doing different things. They all need different
Mm,
inputs. 2 on one edge of the roof, where the conditions are slightly different. They've flowered twice this year. They've fruited twice this year. Um, and that's the changing nature of climate. In the UK in general, but particularly in London, you see some quite bizarre things happening. But pest and disease is
yes, you
becoming more
do.
frequent. And I would say it's also, again, what's client led. I had an interesting conversation about the number of jaggy edges to leaves where the solitary bees had been out and given leaves a good chew to create their nests. And I think it comes hand in hand we can't have uniform, consistent, tidy, clean, manicured landscape when we have a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency, and importantly, as contractors are now challenged with the new standard of well building, where it's zero chemical use, and that's a great thing because we shouldn't be using chemicals for controlling pest and disease. But you'll know that some pest and disease you cannot control necessarily in the time that you have available. You have to be very life cycle specific. So we're seeing huge influx of vine weevil in London, and that's a pest that needs targeted and timely control. And if you miss that opportunity, certainly early on at planting, you'll certainly have a life cycle on site where you're then dealing with the consequences of roots being chewed off and then leaves being chewed off later on, and it will take you a year to get on top of that pest.
Interesting. But it's so great to hear that this is a growing trend and that the science is there and the practice is there. It takes a huge investment from the client to get it planted and looked after. But just finally, tell us again your favourite 3 species for planting on roofs.
So Parotia persica or Vanessa is a cultivar that's great. Gymnocladus, I've planted that now 5 times, and it's a great tree. It's very, very climate resilient. And Astrea capinifolia, that's one of my favourite trees. So the hop hornbeam, it's great on a roof. It's great on the ground floor. It can respond well in a suds basin. It can respond well in a urban street scene. So I'd love to see those 3 trees specified more on schemes in the future.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, it's been wonderful to have a real insight into the growing trend of trees on buildings. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. Thank you for asking me to come on.